Greetings Acolytes, and welcome back to the Ordo Griseo, the Emperor's secret society against the enemy that is unpainted models. Today we're taking you through starting with no hobby supplies and an empty desk, through to painting your first miniature, what you actually need, and what it'll actually cost. Obviously, the first thing you'll need to start painting miniatures for your chosen game is the miniatures themselves. Now you can choose whatever models you like, however for your first miniature I would advise something smaller like a basic infantry unit such as Space Marine Tactical Squads or Intercessors, Imperial Guard Infantry Squads, Orc Boys, Gaunts, as a hero or tank requires a bit more detail and time investment, so it's best to really nail the basics before you move on to them. A typical infantry squad is around the £30 mark from Games Workshop, though some cheaper options are out there where you get a couple of miniatures and even some come with paints and a brush to get you going. For this video I raided my bits box for some unbuilt models and found this old Astra Militarum Guardsman sprue with enough bits left on it to make 3 complete guardsmen. Once you've selected and bought the model, it's time to prepare for assembly. First, remove the pieces of the model you wish to build. The ideal tool for removing these is a set of flat-nosed modelling clippers, however I'm using a hobby knife. Hobby clippers are good, but can get quite pricey, and you can do a more than adequate job with just a knife. It just requires a little extra cleanup at the end. Hobby knives can be found online anywhere from around £2 to £3, and hobby clippers cost from around £5, though cheaper clippers are normally cheap for a reason. What you want to do is get the clippers or knife blade as close to the model as you can, and cut or slice through where it connects to the sprue, as you can see me do here on these models. Now I should say, if you are going with a cheaper knife option, knives are sharp, they cut things, so please cut the model, not your fingers. It, not surprisingly, hurts quite a bit, so if you're of the clumsy persuasion, perhaps get some clippers. Start by using the knife to cut away any large chunks, and then when we get close to the surface of the model, use a scraping motion to smooth it out. We then want to remove any mould lines you can see on the model. Now mould lines are left over from the manufacturing process of making miniatures and will pretty much always be there, though they are less obvious on more modern miniatures from Games Workshop, and the models I'm using here were designed almost 20 years ago, so the mould lines are pretty bad. Games Workshop does sell a mould line removal tool, but I've tried it and honestly I don't think it's worth the money. As with the sprue tabs, we'll be using a scraping motion here with the knife to smooth out these mould lines, being careful not to apply too much pressure as we don't want to create flat spots. Just be sure to take your time and go at your own pace. It's a lot easier to remove more material than it is to try and add material back in when you're done. Now we have all our pieces removed from the sprue, it is time to assemble the model. Now this task may seem daunting at first, however most Games Workshop kits come with instructions, so as long as you follow the steps, you'll be just fine, and then later, once your confidence builds, you can start experimenting with mixing things up to add some extra variety to your models, or even full-blown conversions. These models are plastic, so to glue these together we're going to be using some Games Workshop plastic glue. A bottle of glue this size will cost around £5 from Games Workshop, and for plastic miniatures it's the best thing to bond parts as it chemically welds them together. Now for resin or metal miniatures, and some hard plastics, super glue will be required. We want just a small dab of glue here on the side of the part you wish to connect. Too much will spill from the joint and make a kind of unsightly mess. Working on this scale, small details count, so as with every step, just take your time. If you put too much on a joint, just wipe it away onto a tissue, your trousers, underneath the desk, wherever. Or be cheeky and wipe it on a different joint and glue 2 joints at the same time, saving fractions of a pence. Now when assembling the models, you do have to consider the pose and movement of the model, but we won't go too in depth with composition at this point. Just put the model together as per the instructions, or in a way that looks cool and not broken. Nobody's expecting a masterpiece at this stage, regardless of what the internet tells you. Some people do prefer to leave certain parts off the miniature on this stage, such as the gun arms or not attaching the model to the base. This is so they can get in and do detail work behind it easier. However, for your first few minis and basic infantry, it's fine to just glue them together now. This is more for higher painting levels or more detailed models. It's personal preference, and there's ways to paint the model, which makes this step kind of unnecessary. However, as you progress and build and paint more models, You will find the way that works best for you, and there's no real wrong answers here. At this stage your models are together, and if you want, you can play a game with them. There's been many a clash of grey armies over the history of the hobby. However, most friendly local gaming stores do require you to have painted models, and let's face it, painted models look so much cooler. At the end of the day, would you rather have a unit like this, or like this? The first step to painting a mini is priming the model. This step allows the paint from later steps to stick to the model better, and helps the paint job survive the battles to come. There's several ways to do this, from painting it on with a brush, using cans of spray, or even with an airbrush. Personally, I use an airbrush that was in the region of £100 for my priming, and I do it in 2 stages, however, this isn't necessary. Priming with a brush is cheaper as it uses paints you likely already have, but isn't as durable as other methods. The best balance between durability and cost for a beginner would likely be a spray can. It's got a low initial investment, and it's got good durability. You can use bespoke miniature primers from Games Workshop from between £12 and £15, or alternatively, go to your local Halfords equivalent and find some cheap primer for car plastics. For choosing which colour to prime, I usually go for a darker colour, and that'll help the shadow fall in the recesses of the model better. Though if you're feeling quite fancy and willing to spend a little extra, you can do what's called a zenithal prime. This is where a dark colour is sprayed over the entire model, and then a lighter colour sprayed angled from above to catch the raised areas of the model. This can be really helpful in spotting the areas of the model where light would naturally fall, and is also a really helpful tool if you choose to go down the route of speed paints or contrast paints, as this style of priming will show through and help the models pop. For the sake of the video here, I've gone with a zenithal prime, using black and grey, because I have the tools and the paints already. Though if you're starting out, maybe just grab a can of black spray. As with any new hobby, there's always a chance that you won't actually enjoy it, and if you don't like painting minis after your first few, the less money you've spent at this point the better. Now I would advise, if you're using spray paints or airbrushes, that you do it in a well ventilated area, and preferably somewhere you don't mind if it gets a bit messy. Definitely don't use spray paints at the dining table, for example. Overspray in the dining room just isn't a good look. If the weather's decent, take it outside. So priming done, let's talk about actually painting the model. Obviously you'll need paints. The majority of model paints out there are acrylic based, but there are also paints out there known as speed paints or contrast paints, as well as washes and technical paints. For this video I have the basic start painting set from the Army Painter. It includes basic colours, a brush and 1 wash, so it's a good set for just starting out in the hobby, and costing £25 I think it's quite a good deal just to get you going. So setting up the painting area. You want everything within easy reach, and I use an Army Painter painting station for this, but it isn't really necessary. You just want a nice flat space like a desk or dining table with a chair. Standing for hours while hunched over painting a miniature isn't the most fun way to spend your Saturday. You'll also want a cup of water for rinsing your brush out in between your colours. You want your brushes, your paints, and some paper towel, toilet roll. And of course your miniatures. So it should look a bit like this. If you're doing it on a surface that you might not want to get paint on, then also grab some old newspapers if they're still a thing, or some cardboard and put it down on the surface to protect the area. Now if you're using dropper bottles like the Army Painter range, then you'll also need a palette. There's a lot of options out there ranging from free to silly money. Personally I use a sample square or wet wall that I pinched from work, as it had been there longer than me and it was getting chucked out anyway. Any flat plastic surface will do for now, so just use whatever you can get your hands on for cheap. Even if you're not using dropper bottle paints, I'd still recommend using a palette to aid you in thinning the paints down later. Finally, painting. It's been a fair whack of effort to get us here, but we're finally ready, so let's get going. I like to start from the deepest colours and recesses and work my way outwards, as this helps reduce accidental painting of areas, or at least helps us cover it up later. Now take your chosen paint, give it a good old shake, mixing up the paint and the medium inside the bottle or container to get a nice consistent colour. Then, when it's suitably shook up, drop a few drops onto your palette and close up the bottle. This helps prevent the paint drying up and will make it last longer. Then take your brush, dampen it in the water and slowly mix the paint into the water. As always, take your time with this, looking for a milky consistency. It's cheaper in the long run to go back in and add more water to the paint than it is to add paint to the water in order to get the consistency that you want, although it is a lot about feeling it out and experimenting with it. This paint consistency can be used to create different effects, but that's a whole other topic. Once mixed, load up your paintbrush with the paint. We want a decent amount on there, but don't want it overflowing, so we can still choose where we actually put the paint. Controlling the flow of the paint here is more important than getting full coverage in a single coat, as if you just put the paint on too thick, it'll start to obscure the tiny details on the model, and it can make it look like a colourful blob, which unless you play Nurgle, isn't what you want. With paint on the brush, we just work our way around the model, making sure we work systematically to cover all the bits we want, being as neat as possible, almost like painting by numbers. Try and stay within the lines and not get paint where we don't want it. Though if you do get paint on other areas, don't stress, as it can be cleaned up later on when we paint that area. It's just always better to take your time and be as neat as possible, especially when you're first starting out, as it's a good habit to form. Now there's a lot out there on the internet of, quite frankly, amazing painting. Proper experts who have been doing this for years, and some of their painting looks almost computer generated. I'll be honest here, when you first start out, you will not be painting like that, unless you have a whole heap of painting experience beforehand, in which case you probably don't need this video to help you out, but thanks for swinging by anyway. It's important that we don't get wrapped up in the whole internet wow factor of amazing models, and as one miniature painter to another, I was like that even before the surge of amazing painting on YouTube, comparing my painting to the box art or the golden demon entries in the rulebooks and codices. However, a painted model is a painted model. Every step we take past assembly just makes our miniature cooler and more awesome. The minute you put that first bit of paint on the miniature, you're already winning. So don't stress if your model isn't perfect. Painting models takes time to learn and is a continuous process, and it never ends. So for now, let's just get all the base colours down as neat as possible so our mini is as awesome as it can be, and it's a heck of a lot nicer than basic grey plastic. Remember, each time we paint a model, we get a little bit better and build our skills just a little bit. Even if we're not trying out the latest techniques or products or YouTube sensations, it's a lot better to have a basic clean model than a messy technical mishmash. It's only a plastic soldier. So now we've applied all the basic colours on the model, and you can see they're starting to come together and they look a bit like this. I mean, they're pretty cool, right? So much better than just unpainted grey plastic. So if this is as far as you want to take painting models,
sounds cool.
The miniatures are totally battle ready and can rip across whatever fictional universe they belong in. But it would be remiss of me to miss one really simple step that would knock them up a notch, especially since it comes in the paint set we're using for the video: washes. Now washes act differently to normal acrylic paints and flow a lot better, so they'll settle into the recesses of the model and shade them. It's one way to use the 3D nature of the model to our advantage. They add contrast and are a really simple way to make your models pop. And honestly, this was the stage I stayed at for years. I was happy-ish with the results. So we take our wash and, like before, give it a good shake before dropping it out onto the palette. Unlike the acrylic paints we used earlier, there's no need to thin washes, they're already pretty thin. However, you can still thin them to play with the opacity of the wash if you're looking for a more subtle effect. Again, it comes back to the experimentation. So load up your brush, not too heavy though, as it is easier to add more than to take away, and start working your way around the model. Here we're applying strong tone from the Army Painter range across the whole model quite heavily to give it a washed out, battle dirty look, like he's been in the field fighting the enemies of the Imperium for days, weeks or even months. When applying the wash, it can pool in areas, naturally flowing down the model. If this happens, just take a clean damp brush and wick it away with the tip of the brush until you're happy with the amount of wash left behind. Once the wash is applied to the model, leave it to dry. Washes can take a little bit longer than normal acrylic paints to dry, especially if the acrylics are thinned, so allow plenty time for this. Once dry, the model looks something like this, an extra layer of depth to the model, and it looks a lot more battle hardened. After all, our plastic soldiers are engaged in miniature warfare. The final step with any model, though it can be worked on throughout the assembly or painting process depending on what you choose, is basing the model. The base is the stand the model, well, stands on. It can be a key part into tying the model into the environment, or a blank frame to separate the model out and highlight them. There's so much you can do with basing that it's a massive topic in general. I try to imagine the model in its home environment, and you can see some examples here: paved slabs for the British themed Imperial Guard, spaceship decks for Nurgle space pirates, and a sea of blood for a blood god devoted berserker. A variety of effects and techniques can be applied to the base, but for this video I've just painted them black to frame the model, as I don't actually have an army for these to be a part of. So now we've finished our first models, and have a good idea on the basics, and have a feel for if we actually enjoy it and want to take it further. Now obviously models can have a ridiculous amount of time investment, and many other techniques are out there other than what's covered in this video. And if mini painting is something you enjoy, then from here the only way really is up. Never stop learning, never stop experimenting until you're happy with the models you produce. There'll always be a time versus quality balance as you go forward, but hopefully this is a good first step into the hobby. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you ever so much for watching until the end, and listen to the rambling of a painter who's been doing this way too long. I hope you enjoyed the video and took some good points to apply to your own models, even if it's just that not every mini needs to be a piece of artwork deserving the highest of awards or a display case. Any step past priming the model is a win in the eyes of the Emperor. As always, if there's anything you want to see in a future video, leave it down in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.